understanding the security requirements. So now what do you mean by security requirement? Security requirements are the specific needs or conditions which must be met to ensure the protection of infrastructure from threats and vulnerabilities. So we need to properly define the requirements, help in designing, implementing, and maintaining a secure infrastructure. Now, when I say security requirements, security, so as the first step, now when you are moving towards, when you are talking about certification in terms of CISSP and CCSP, in CISSP and CCSP, we mainly deal with this part, that is how to think like a manager. Okay, so we basically, but when you are talking about from a security architect perspective, a security architect or ISSAP is much more in-depth technical oriented certification than your CISSP and CCSP. So you need to know you need to know your background. So you need to know what is a DLP, you need to know what's a DRM, you need to know what's a database activity monitoring. So now the first step as a good security architect is what? That is, you need to understand the security requirement. What is the need and condition which must be met to ensure the protection? Now, when I say security requirements are the specific needs or condition, now the needs and condition, it can be towards the business, it can be of the business owners, it can be from the stakeholders, it can be from your legal and regulatory requirements in order to meet the legal and regulatory requirement. That is the reason why I say security requirements are the specific needs or conditions which must be met to ensure the protection of infrastructure from the threats and vulnerabilities. So you need to properly define what is the requirement and how you are going to design, implement, maintain, and support the infrastructure, which makes sure that the stakeholders, the business owners, the legal and regulatory requirements are met. So basically, if you see in the right hand side, so when we are talking about security requirements, so security requirements deals with multiple elements. First is the organizational. The first thing which we have in terms of security requirement is the business case clear on security requirements. Why people do not care? Because there is no incentives to do something about these requirements, no understanding of what the requirement means, or there are different perceptions of priority. Who is responsible for implementing the security requirements? So normally in the organization, your developers, CISOs, business representatives, product owners, these are the people who are responsible for implementing the security requirements. This is when I am talking about implementing the security requirements in detail, means into actionable controls. So let's say if I am talking about that, I want to, like, I am processing sensitive PII data. Now according to the GDPR principle, my sensitive PII data should be masked. Now this is my GDPR requirement, and this is what is being agreed by business owners and stakeholders, and they have given this in the form of policy. But now to convert that policy into actionable standard, actionable control, how we are going to implement that control, this is where your security architect, your product owners, this is where they come to the picture. So you have to take end to end accountability in order to implement the control. So now when we are talking about the identifying the business objectives, so alignment, ensure security requirements aligns with the organizational business goals and objective. Do an impact analysis, understand how the infrastructure supports critical business functions, what impact security incidents might have. When you do the impact analysis, this is also understand that what would happen if the data masking control is not in place. Okay, tomorrow because of this control is not working effectively or it is not in place, if there is a security incident happens, okay, what kind of legal and regulatory fines the organization is have to pay if they don't abide with the legal and regulatory requirements. So you need to conduct the risk assessment, identify the potential threats which can impact the infrastructure. It can be a cyber attacks, it can be a natural disaster, it can be a malicious insider. Do the vulnerability assessment, determine what kind of weakness which are there in the current infrastructure which could be exploited. Now one so when we say vulnerability assessment, can we say vulnerability assessment can be, we can also say that We can, in as a part of the vulnerability assessment, we are doing the gap analysis, right team? We are doing the gap analysis. So we are identifying what are the current controls which we are having, what is the current state, what is the target state in which we have to be there, and what is the gap between the current state and the target state. Do the impact analysis, assess the potential impact of the identified threats and vulnerabilities of the organization. Do the risk evaluation, prioritize the risk based on the likelihood and potential impact to focus on the most critical areas. Now, when I am talking about conducting a risk assessment, let me give you a live example for this. So let's say if I am talking about databases. So now we have a different kind of database, like we have a SQL Server database, we have a NoSQL database, right? Now majority of the legal and regulatory requirements says that when you have a database and when you have sensitive data stored on the database, you must have database activity monitoring. Security Guardian is there, Imperva is there. These are some products which are there in the database activity monitoring, which can monitor the sensitive database, which sensitive data which is stored on the database, correct? Yeah, so why they are not going for native auditing solutions which are there already in the database? Because the problem with the native auditing solution is what? Native auditing is directly in control with the DBA, right? A DBA has a privilege to enable or disable the auditing on the server level. What if we have a malicious DBA and if he or she wants to steal a sensitive data, they can disable the native auditing, steal the data and re-enable it again. They can modify the logs. So that is the reason why the organization is willing. They don't want a control which can be, they don't want to use a native control which can be there indirectly of the database, which can be controlled by a DBA or a database architect. That is the reason they are doing such a heavy investment on procuring a database activity monitoring tool, because a database activity monitoring tool is something which is outside of the DBA control. They cannot control. If they do something malicious, it will be captured. So this is what, when we are talking about conducting a risk assessment, do the threat identification, conduct the vulnerability analysis assessment, do the impact analysis, and prioritize the risk based on their likelihood and what is their potential impact to focus on the most critical areas. Now, when we are talking about determining, we also need to determine the legal, regulatory, and compliance requirement. Understand what is the legal, regulatory, compliance requirement. So, like what is GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS has to say about it. Compliance is ensured that security requirements comply with these regulation and standards, and make sure that you maintain a thorough documentation of how compliance requirements are met. So tomorrow if my stakeholders or if my auditors they come and ask me the evidence, I should be able to provide sufficient evidence to my business owners, to my stakeholders, to my CISO, to my auditors, that the control which I have procured, the control which we have implemented, the control which I am maintaining, it is working effectively. So now when we are talking about the defining security policies and controls, so uh, one thing is we have a access control. So now when we are talking about access control talks about who can access what resources and under what conditions. So we have role-based access control, we have rule-based access control, we have mandatory access control, we have discretionary access control, we have a non-discretionary access control, we have attribute-based access control. All these are different controls which we are having. When we are talking about data protection, specify the controls for protecting the data. So the controls which are there for protecting the data at rest and in use and in motion are different. Live example, the data which is there in motion, we use SSL TLS, we use link encryption, we use your SSL TLS, we use your link encryption to protect the data which is there in transit. If I am talking about the data in use, for to protect the data in use, we have your DLP, we have your DRM, we have your obfuscation, we have masking. All these are the controls which we use to protect the data in use. When we are talking about data at rest, we use the BitLocker drive encryption, we use the database encryption, row level, column level encryption. So different kind of the, based on the type of data, we have different kind of controls. When we are talking about network security, we have requirements for network segmentation which can be done on the firewall. We can use your intrusion detection prevention system, we can use VLANs, we can use VPCs, we can use VNet. So depending on like where you are trying to do the segmentation within the organization, within the on premises, if you are trying to do the segmentation, we can use the VLANs, we can use network segmentation firewall. But let's say we are doing the segmentation on the cloud, we have to use the VPCs, we have to use the VNets. All these are the controls. Now when we are talking about the incident response, defined requirements for detecting, reporting and responding to the security incident. So now once an incident has happened, how we are going to make sure that we are able to contain the incident, how we are going to make sure that we are able to contain the incident, because the ultimate effectiveness of your incident response team, it works on this factor, that how much time your incident response team is taking to contain the incident, how much time your incident response team is taking to contain the incident. Now when we are talking about establishing the security requirement, confidentiality, ensure that the information is only accessible to those who are authorized to see it. Integrity, protect the data from unauthorized alteration and ensure that it is accurate. Availability talks about ensure that the system and the data are accessible to only authorized users when needed. Make sure that before you provide access to any form of data, make sure that we have a proper authentication and authorization to verify the user identities controlling the access. And finally, whatever access is given, make sure that you audit and monitor the activities and make sure that the logs should be stored on a SIM system. It should be tamper proof. So policies basically set a high level expectations which comes from the organizational. We identify the control objectives to identify the conditions to meet. This is where we use the best practices and frameworks. We define standards to meet the requirements and we implement security controls to establish safeguard that meets the standards. Tamper proof means where you are not able to modify the logs. Live example, one another live example I can give you. When we say database activity monitoring, in once DML and DDL command is being executed by a DBA or a non-privileged user, and once it is stored on a database activity monitoring, you can run the report and you can get the data, but you will not be able to modify the activity. You will not be able to tamper the logs. Clear now? So live example, your security information and event management, SIM. Once a data is written into the SIM, you can read it. It is like write once, read many times. I repeat, write once, read many times. That is what it is. So now when we are talking about what are the key steps in developing security requirement, make sure that you have an implementation plan, a detailed plan for deploying the solutions, including the timelines and the responsibilities. So live example, if we are talking about deploying a security solutions, so before we do any deployment of any security solutions, we also have to do something which is called as a POC, proof of concept. So like if your organization is already having a security information and event management such as IBM QRadar, now later on your organization is deciding, rather than now next year your organization IBM QRadar contract license contract is going to be renewed. So before that your organization is planning to move from IBM QRadar to another SIM solution, let's say Logarithm, or let's say Splunk. So when you conduct the POC, in the POC itself, when you are deploying the security solutions, you have to whatever rules, building blocks, reference set, use cases which are currently working on your existing SIM solution, you need to compare it with the another solution and make sure that that another solution which your company or your business owners are the business owners are planning to procure, it meets your existing security requirements or existing security needs. Because tomorrow you are the one who is going to evaluate the product, you are the one who is going to compare the product. So tomorrow if the organization goes and procures that product, it is you who is going to be responsible for managing implementation and deployment. So it is your key responsibility to deploy the security solutions and conduct the POC and make sure that whatever current requirements which is being fulfilled by the existing product is all being met by the new product. We must have timelines and responsibilities. So you cannot, if you are talking about comparing a new product with an existing tool, so you cannot have a larger timelines, like you cannot give unrealistic timelines such as 3 months or 4 months. within 1 month or within 15 days, you have to make sure that whatever current use cases you are already having in the solution, you need to compare it and tell yes or no that whether this product can replace our existing product or not. You need to develop a strategy for testing the controls to ensure that they meet requirements, such as conducting the penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, review and adjust. Regularly review and adjust the requirements and controls which is based on the test results and evolving threats. Finally, document and communicate the requirement and make sure whatever testing you are doing, document it clearly, whether it is meeting the stakeholders' needs, whether it is meeting the current requirements or not, which is being fulfilled, what is the kind of gaps. Clearly document all the requirements, policies and controls, that whether they are working effectively or not. And finally, communicate these results to the relevant stakeholders who will decide whether they want to procure this product or whether they want to continue using the same product which they are already using. So what are the best practices for developing security requirement? Engage the stakeholders. Involve key stakeholders in the requirement development process to ensure the need and concerns are addressed. Use standards such as NIST, ISO 27001 as a basis for developing security requirements. Integrate security requirements which can be reviewed and updated regularly to address new threats and changes in the organizational infrastructure. And finally, test and validate the security requirements and solutions to ensure that they are effective and they meet the intended goals. So these are some things which comes under the developing the security requirements. Now, when we are talking about the next topic, which is develop the infrastructure security requirement based on on-premises, cloud, and hybrid. So as a ISSAP, when you are planning to go for security architecture certification of IC square, you need to have an in-depth knowledge on the on-premises, cloud, and hybrid. It is recommended that you prepare well on the domain 1, 2, and 3 of the CCSP. Okay, domain 1, 2, and 3 of the CCSP. So now when we are talking about from the on-premises, in the on-premises, we have infrastructure security requirements such as access control. So implement physical security measures, logs, surveillance, biometric access to protect the servers, data centers, and network equipment. Have environmental controls. Now, when we are talking about environmental controls, use the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. Now, when we are talking about HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, there are two types of cooling which happens in the HVAC. One is your latent cooling and one is your sensitive cooling. Any idea what is the difference between a latent and sensitive cooling? Sensitive cooling is something which we use it within the data center, specifically for the racks and servers. And latent cooling is something which we use in the operational facilities where people work. Live example, your ODCs, cubicles, your centralized air conditioning system which is used in the office premises, they are your latent cooling. So use environmental controls, ensure protection against environmental threats such as fire suppression system, climate control, etc. In terms of network security, deploy the firewalls to protect the network boundaries and segment the internal networks. Have IDS and IPS to monitor and respond to the suspicious network activities. And when we are talking about from the host security perspective, implement operating system hardening by disabling the unnecessary services and applying the security patches and configuring the security settings. When we are talking about from the endpoint protection, use antivirus, anti-malware, and endpoint detection and response tools for endpoint protection. When we are talking about access management, so have an authentication and authorization. So implement strong authentication methods such as your multi-factor authentication and role-based access control. And wherever it is required to use the privileged accounts, use a privileged access management such as CyberArk, Arcos spam solution, which can secure and monitor the privileged accounts with the least privilege principle. When we are talking about from the data protection, encrypt the sensitive data at rest and in transit using stronger encryption methods, protocols, and make sure that you conduct regular backups and test the recovery procedures. Now, why do we say that testing the recovery procedures is equally important? To avoid any last minute surprises. So it is equally important to take the backups. How it is important to take the backups, it is also important to regularly test the backups. to avoid any last minute surprises. So now normally when we are talking about from the cloud-based infrastructure security requirements, we always have a shared responsibility model. So cloud provider responsibilities, security of the cloud infrastructure, including the physical security and the cloud platform itself. So as a customer, when you are going for the cloud, you should clearly document it in the contract and SLA. What is the role and responsibility of the cloud customer versus what is the role and responsibility of the cloud provider. Now, when we are talking about from the shared security, shared responsibility model, shared responsibility model is not only there in the cloud. If you see in your day-to-day life, shared responsibility model is in every element. Even when you are purchasing a life insurance policy from LIC, okay, or even if you are purchasing a health policy, even in these policies also, you are actually working as a shared responsibility model only. So now one live example I can give you. So like when you are purchasing a life insurance policy or when you are purchasing a health policy, what is the first thing which you do? You look for what is the sum assured amount you are looking for. Then they also you also check that in the policy scope, what are the kind of health diseases this policy is, or my life insurance policy or my health policy is going to cover. Then once you decide to purchase a policy, you have to fill a form where you have to clearly define, you have to clearly tell the policy company that what kind of health disorders you are actually having. Like if you are having diabetes, have you gone for bypass, if do you have any kind of other kind of health diseases. So you have to be honest in filling the form, in providing the correct details, because based on that details only the premium which you have to pay in order to purchase for that health insurance is going to be decided. If they find that you have given some wrong information, the policy provider has this clause in the policy that they can suspend your policy or they can decide not to provide any claim. So that is what when we say everywhere we are actually going with the shared responsibility model only. So in the contract and SLA, we need to clearly define what is the role and responsibility of the cloud provider versus the customer. When we are talking about data protection, encrypted, when we are storing sensitive data in the cloud, it is mandatory that the sensitive data should always be encrypted, both it at rest and in transit. Utilize the cloud provider encryption services and manage the encryption keys. Always remember that the encryption keys of the data should always be there with the cloud customer, not the cloud provider. Because if the cloud provider has access to your encryption keys, they can host the customer as a hostage, which is called as your vendor lock-in. Implement access controls to implement, identify and access management policies to control access to the cloud resources. When we are talking about in terms of network security, implement security groups and network ACLs. When we are talking about implementing security groups in the cloud, the security groups which we create in the cloud in the AWS and Azure, is it a stateful or a stateless firewall what we use in the cloud? What we use in the cloud, is it a stateful or stateless? It is a stateful, because you only create an inbound rule, you don't have to create an outbound rule. Correct? What is allowed to come in, naturally it is allowed to go out. Right? Now when we are talking about the compliance and governance, regulatory compliance ensure cloud deployments meet regulatory requirements and industry standards. When we are talking about auditing and monitoring, enable logging and monitoring services to track access and changes within the cloud environment. And finally, when we are talking about from the incident management, develop and test the incident response plans which are specific to the cloud environments. So now when we are talking about from the hybrid infrastructure security requirements, integration security, make sure when you are transferring the data between the cloud provider and the on premises, the data should be encrypted by implementing secure protocols such as link encryption or SSL TLS or IPsec. If you are using APIs, so APIs are also called your messengers. Secure APIs used to integrate on-premises and cloud systems to prevent unauthorized access and data breaches. When we are talking about from a unified security management, implement consistent policies such as develop and enforce consistent security policies across both the on-premises and cloud environment. Make sure that you have a centralized logging and monitoring tool to ensure gain visibility into the security events across the hybrid infrastructure. This is where we use the CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, such as Netscope, where we can get centralized logging and monitoring across my hybrid cloud, across my hybrid infrastructure or a multi-cloud environment. Wherever possible, you under access management, implement identity federation, where you can take leverage of a single sign-on for where the customers, the end user, they don't have to log into multiple resources. Have the federation work with the single sign-on to improve the user experience. And finally, when we are talking about from a data protection perspective, classify the data based on the sensitivity and criticality of the data and apply appropriate controls both on the on-prem and cloud environments. And finally, implement the DLP and compensate this with the DRM. Compensate this with the DRM, digital rights management. Compensate this with the DRM, digital rights management. So if my primary control is down, if my primary control is down, my compensating control can prevent this from happening. Now the next is when we are talking about from the infrastructure security architecture perspective. The next thing is we are going to discuss about the wireless, email, VoIP, unified communication, DNS and NTP. DNS and NTP. Now when we are talking about from the wireless network, a wireless network basically refers to the computer network that makes use of RF connections. So now when we are talking about from the wireless network, a wireless network basically refers to the computer network that makes use of RF connections between nodes in the network. So when we are talking about wireless network, they are a popular solution for homes, business and telecommunication networks. So now what are the major challenges? So now when we are talking about the security challenges, when we are talking about from the security challenges, so what are the primary challenges in terms of wireless network? We have eavesdropping, where attackers can intercept the wireless signals to gain unauthorized access to the data. There is a probability of rogue access point where unauthorized devices can be connected to the network. So what is the best practice? Regularly update the wireless access point firmware and deploy the IDS and IPS to monitor for suspicious activity. It is also recommended, that when you are talking about using a wireless, it is always recommended that you use the WPA2 or WPA3, and wherever you possible, use the enterprise infrastructure login, like use the Active Directory authentication or LDAP authentication to secure your wireless networks. So use the WPA3 for the latest and most secure encryption. Or if WPA3 is not possible for encryption, you can use the WPA2 with AES if WPA3 is not available. As I was mentioning, you can use the WPA2 Enterprise with Radius, remote authentication dial-in user service for robust user authentication. We also have something called as a EAP TLS, which is also called as the most secure form of authentication. Now why we say EAP TLS is most secure, at the same time it is more costly, because the EAP TLS, it uses both server and client side certificate. I repeat, it uses both server and client side certificate. Okay. Now when we are talking about your SSID management, disable the SSID to reduce the visibility. So we must have a unique SSID which is non-predictable. And when you are use the network segmentation such as guest networks to implement separate guest network to isolate them from internal resources. Live example, when you visit the hotels, 7-star or 5-star hotels, in these high hotels you must have seen that for guests they have a separate guest network which will only have access to the internet. That guest network will be completely isolated from the internal resources. That is what your network segmentation, which we can do on the wireless level. And finally, use VLANs to segment the network traffic. So now when we are talking about from the email security perspective, email security is the best practice for protecting the email accounts and communications from unauthorized access, loss, or compromise. So where organizations can enhance their email security posture by establishing the policies and tools using which to protect against the malicious threats such as malware, spam, and phishing attacks. Security challenges which are there. So we have phishing and spoofing. Attackers use deceptive emails to trick users. Data interception. Emails can be intercepted during transmission. So the best practice is educate users on recognizing the phishing attempts and regularly review and update the email security policies and software. So the best way is make sure that we have all the employees conducting the security training and awareness session to educate the users that how modern kind of phishing attempts are happening. So we have, what are the kind of controls we have? We have TLS, which can encrypt the email in transit between mail servers. We have a SMIME or PGP, which can encrypt the email content itself to ensure confidentiality and integrity. For authentication, we have different kind of records such as SPF record, which can validate the sender server IP address to prevent spoofing. We have a DKIM record, which can add the cryptographic signatures to verify email integrity. We have DMARC, which can provide a mechanism to report and enforce policies based on SPF and DKIM results. And finally, we have a content filtering, which can where we can use the anti-spam solutions, filter out unwanted and potentially harmful emails, and scan the attachment for malicious content. Now the last part which we have is your voice over IP. So voice over IP is basically a form of communication that allows you to make a phone calls over a broadband internet connection instead of typical analog telephone lines. So where we use basic VoIP access. So live example, your packet switching, your 4G, 5G, your LTE, Volt, these are all live examples of voice over IP only. So what are the primary security challenges which we have? VoIP calls can be intercepted without encryption, so eavesdropping is possible, and attackers might impersonate legitimate users or services. So what are the best practices? Regularly update the VoIP systems and apply security patches. When we are talking about monitor the voice over IP traffic for abnormal patterns indicating of the potential attacks. So what are the security measures? Encryption. Use the secure real-time transport protocol to encrypt voice data during transmission. Secure signaling and control traffic, we can use the TLS. For authentication, we can use the strong user authentication such as so we have your voice over IP aware firewalls, which we can use for encryption, network segmentation, etc. We can use ensure users are verified before granting access to the VoIP services. And finally, for segmentation, have VLAN or VoIP, where we can isolate the VoIP traffic from other network traffic to enhance the security and performance. Now a live example I can give you when we are talking about from the authentication perspective is that one live example I can give you. Normally in the organization, when you want access to when you are having an IP phone and when you want access to dial international calls or international numbers, you normally require to have a auth code which you have to request from the telecommunication team, right team? And every time when you are dialing an international number, you have to punch that auth code. Until and unless you punch, your call will not be connected. So that is a live example of authentication. Now when we are talking about UC stands for your unified communication. Unified communication talks about the streamlines where we are doing multiple form of enterprise communication such as voice, video and messaging into one interface. Live example, your WhatsApp, your Telegram, these where you can use your voice, video and messaging all into the one interface. That's a live example of a unified communication only. Where, so what are the components which are involved? So it encompasses your Microsoft Teams, your Cisco WebEx. These are also live example of a unified communication. So where we can encompass various communication tools such as email, instant messaging, voice over IP, video conferencing and collaboration platforms. So now when we are talking about the security challenges, so ensuring communications are kept confidential and unaltered, these are the primary security challenges which we are having. Integration risk, combining multiple services can introduce new vulnerabilities. So the best practice is continuously monitor the unified communication systems for potential security incidents and provide training to users on secure usage practices. So live example for unified communication is the best control which we can have for unified communication is your end-to-end encryption. So your end-to-end encryption protects the confidentiality of communication from the sender to the recipient. TLS secures signaling and data transmission in UC systems. So live example when we are talking about from the end-to-end encryption, when we are talking about from the end-to-end encryption, in end-to-end encryption in your WhatsApp, in your Microsoft Teams, in your Cisco WebEx, whenever you are joining the calls over the audio bridge, the entire or over the internet audio, it is all end-to-end encrypted, protected by a TLS protocol, right, which is used for encryption. So that's a live example. When we are talking about access control, use multi-factor authentication and strong password policies. For access management, you can use a role-based access control to limit access based on the user roles, and make sure that your unified communication software such as WebEx, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, they are regularly updated to address the latest security vulnerabilities. Finally, we have your DNS. So DNS turns domain names into IP addresses which browsers use to load internet pages. Every device connected to the internet has its own IP address which is used by the other device to locate the device. Security challenges. So we have a DNS spoofing, caching, poisoning, where attackers can manipulate the DNS responses to redirect the users to malicious sites. DDoS attacks is possible where DNS servers can be targeted to disrupt the service. So the best way is to monitor the DNS traffic for anomalies by taking leverage of the machine learning and AI, and keep the DNS server software up to date and apply security patches. In order to address the DNS spoofing and all, we also recommend the control such as DNS sec, which can protect the confidentiality and integrity of the DNS records, which are stored in the DNS zones. As I was mentioning, your DNSSEC provides cryptographic protection for the DNS data to prevent tampering and spoofing. We can also do the rate limiting, where we can implement rate limits on DNS queries to mitigate the DDoS attacks. Access control, restrict the DNS server access, limit who can query your DNS server, and ensure that they are protected from unauthorized access. So these are the controls which we can protect against the DNS.